My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 34, and I've spent 9 years as a senior real estate attorney. The kind of work where you learn to read a title history the way most people read a face. Instantly, instinctively, spotting the exact clause buried on page 11 that changes who actually owns what, long before the other side realizes you've already found it. I know how to sit across a negotiating table from someone convinced they've already won, and simply wait, patiently, for the moment the paperwork tells the truth they weren't expecting. I did not expect to need that particular patience in a probate courtroom, 4 months after burying my husband, watching my mother-in-law smile at me the way you'd smile at someone you'd already finished beating. "You're doing the right thing, Olivia," Evelyn Harper said, loud enough for the small gallery of reporters gathered near the courtroom doors to hear, her voice carrying the same polished, camera-ready warmth she'd built an entire luxury real estate empire on. "Daniel would want this handled with dignity. I'm glad you finally see that." I sat at the plaintiff's table with a single folder in front of me and my wedding ring still on my finger. 4 months a widow, watching my mother-in-law perform grief and generosity in the same breath for an audience of strangers who had no idea what either of those words had actually cost her over the past 3 decades. The judge hadn't even called the hearing to order yet, and Evelyn had already arranged herself, her attorney, and her practiced expression of gentle magnanimity into exactly the tableau she wanted, photographed on her way out of the building. If you've ever watched someone perform compassion for an audience while doing something the audience would never actually approve of if they understood it, I need you to stay with me, because this hearing does not end where Evelyn Harper expected it to. I want to explain what 4 months of probate court had actually looked like, because I don't think the moment in that courtroom carries its real weight without that context underneath it. Daniel died suddenly, an aneurysm at 36, the kind of death that leaves you making funeral arrangements and grief counselor appointments in the same numb week. No time to prepare, no warning that would have let either of us have the conversations people are supposed to have before it's too late. I was still working through the fog of that first month, taking care of our son Noah, keeping some approximation of a life running for his sake, when Evelyn's attorney filed the first probate challenge, a claim that the family home, purchased before Daniel and I married and held according to Evelyn's version of events in an informal family trust that predated our marriage, should revert to her upon Daniel's death rather than pass to me and Noah. I understood, professionally, exactly how weak that claim actually was under any honest reading of the property's title history. I also understood, personally, exactly how effectively grief could be weaponized against someone too exhausted to fight a battle she technically already knew how to win. Evelyn had spent 3 decades building a public identity around elegance and generosity, celebrated in local business circles for her luxury property developments and her charitable galas, and she brought that same polished performance into every court appearance, positioning herself, consistently, as a grieving mother simply trying to preserve her son's legacy from a daughter-in-law she'd never fully approved of. "She's exhausted," I heard Evelyn tell a reporter once, in the hallway outside an earlier hearing, her voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry. "Grief does strange things to people. I only want what's best for my grandson. Truly." If you've ever watched someone use your own grief as evidence against you in front of people who had no way of knowing better, comment, "I know that performance," below. This story is for you. I want to explain, too, exactly what my marriage to Daniel had actually looked like inside Evelyn's orbit, because the courtroom performance made considerably more sense once I understood the years that preceded it. Evelyn had never approved of me. Not really. Not from the moment Daniel brought me home for the first time and introduced me as the attorney I've been telling you about. I came from a modest background, worked my way through law school with loans and long nights, and I understood, within the first year of our relationship, that Evelyn measured worth almost entirely by the visible trappings of success she'd spent her own career accumulating: the right neighborhoods, the right galas, the right marriages. Daniel could have married considerably more strategically, she told me once, at an anniversary dinner 3 years into our marriage, delivered with the same polished smile she used for everything, as though the comment itself was simply an observation rather than a wound. But he's always followed his heart over his head. It's one of his more endearing qualities. Daniel had laughed it off that night, the way he always did. The specific, practiced deflection of a son who had spent his entire life managing his mother's expectations rather than confronting them directly. I understood, over 8 years of marriage, that Daniel loved his mother and also understood her clearly. The careful, controlled way she managed every relationship in her life as though it were a property acquisition, always calculating what she stood to gain, always positioning herself for maximum advantage, regardless of what the moment actually called for. "She'll come for the house eventually, if anything ever happens to me," Daniel told me once, years before his death, during a rare, unguarded conversation about his mother's business practices that had left him more troubled than usual. Not because she needs the money, because losing control of something she considers rightfully part of the family legacy would feel, to her, like losing an argument she's never once allowed herself to lose. I hadn't understood at the time how literally I would eventually need to remember that conversation. If you've ever had a partner warn you, gently, about exactly what a difficult in-law might do someday, and filed it away without realizing how precisely it would eventually come true, comment, "He knew her better than anyone," below. Daniel's attorney, a careful, quiet man named Michael Lawson, who had handled our estate planning years earlier, sat beside me at the plaintiff's table that morning, and I noticed, though I didn't yet understand why, the particular stillness in his expression. Not the anxious stillness of a man watching his client lose, but something closer to the deliberate calm of someone waiting for a specific moment he already knew was coming. "You don't have to sign anything today if you're not ready," he murmured to me as Evelyn's attorney began arranging his own documents at the opposing table. "I know," I told him, and I meant it in a way he didn't yet understand either. I had spent 4 months exhausted, genuinely exhausted, grieving a husband I hadn't finished loving yet, raising an 8-year-old who asked me nightly when his father was coming home from the trip everyone had told him about, instead of the truth neither of us was ready to say out loud. I had also spent 9 years as an attorney, learning exactly how much could be hidden inside a single, unremarkable-looking attachment to a court filing, and I understood, sitting at that table, that whatever Evelyn believed she was about to win, she had not actually read every page of what she was about to make legally binding. I want to be honest, too, about the specific exhaustion of those 4 months, the same honesty I owe anyone hearing this account. I hadn't spent that time secretly plotting Evelyn's downfall, methodically constructing a case against her the way this story might seem to suggest in hindsight. I had spent most of it simply surviving, getting Noah to school, remembering to eat, answering condolence cards I could barely bring myself to read. What I'd done, in the margins of that exhaustion, was trust. Michael Lawson's quiet, repeated reassurance that Daniel had handled things properly, without ever pressing him for details I didn't yet have the emotional capacity to absorb. If you've ever had to trust that someone else had prepared you for a fight you were too exhausted to prepare for yourself, comment, "Sometimes trust is all you have left," below. Evelyn's attorney rose to present the settlement terms, a straightforward transfer of the family home's title, framed generously as resolving the family's grief with dignity rather than prolonging a painful dispute. Language I recognized immediately as designed for the small cluster of reporters Evelyn had made sure were present. I listened to the terms read aloud, watched Evelyn's practiced, patient smile throughout, and I signed the documents in front of me without a single word of argument. Noah's babysitter had texted me twice that morning, ordinary logistics about pickup time, and I remember glancing at my phone between signatures, grounding myself in the plain, ordinary fact of my son's afternoon schedule, while the rest of the courtroom orbited around a legacy dispute he was still too young to fully understand. I thought, signing that final page, about the specific weight of doing this alone. No husband beside me, no parents nearby, just Michael's quiet, steady presence, and a single folder that held, I hoped, exactly what Daniel had promised me it would. I thought, too, about the last conversation Daniel and I had ever had about his mother, 3 weeks before his death. Unremarkable at the time, the kind of ordinary exchange you don't realize you'll spend the rest of your life replaying. We'd been standing in the kitchen, Noah already asleep upstairs, and Daniel had mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd finally finished that paperwork thing with Michael, the specific vague phrasing he always used for anything related to estate planning, a subject he found tedious enough that he rarely elaborated beyond confirming it was handled. "Do I need to know anything specific?" I'd asked him, only half paying attention, folding laundry at the counter. "Just that you and Noah are protected, whatever happens," he'd said, kissing the top of my head the way he always did when he considered a conversation closed. I made sure of that a long time ago, actually. I just finally got around to updating the details properly. I hadn't pressed further. I had no reason to, that ordinary Tuesday evening, no way of knowing how soon those details would matter or how precisely they'd been designed for exactly the moment I was now sitting inside. I understood, sitting at that plaintiff's table 4 months later, that Daniel's vague, practical reassurance that night had actually been considerably more deliberate than either of us had treated it in the moment. A husband quietly finishing a piece of protection he'd apparently been building for years, delivered with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, never once suggesting how urgently it might eventually be needed. If you've ever replayed an ordinary conversation after loss, only to realize it had actually been someone quietly protecting you all along, comment, "I didn't know that was the moment," below. We're only in Chapter 1. Evelyn's expression, watching me sign, carried a specific, satisfied warmth I recognized as the exact moment she believed the entire battle had ended in her favor. She leaned toward her attorney, murmuring something I couldn't quite hear, and I watched her shoulders relax in the particular way of someone who has just watched a difficult negotiation resolve entirely in their direction. "Thank you for being reasonable, Olivia," she said, loud enough again for the gallery to catch. "I know Daniel would be relieved to see this family finally at peace." I didn't respond to that directly. I simply closed my folder, the same single folder I'd carried into that courtroom, and waited. The same patient, professional stillness I bring to any closing I know is about to reveal something the other side hasn't accounted for yet. Judge Rebecca Collins, presiding, reviewed the settlement documents methodically, page by page, the way I understood. From years of practicing in her courtroom, she reviewed everything, thoroughly, without rushing, regardless of how eager either party might be for a quick resolution. It was the final attachment, 3 pages behind the settlement's main body, that made her pause. If you've ever watched a judge's expression shift, mid-review, in a way that told you the room was about to change entirely, comment, "Here it comes," below. Chapter 2 is where I explain exactly what Daniel left behind and exactly why I signed without a single word of protest. Judge Collins looked up from the attachment, her expression carrying none of the routine, procedural neutrality she'd maintained through the rest of the hearing. "Counsel," she said, addressing both attorneys at once, "I'd like a moment before we proceed further. This attachment references a document I don't see included in today's filing, a trust instrument dated 3 years prior to the decedent's passing, filed under seal with this court's estate division." Evelyn's attorney glanced down at his own copy of the settlement, visibly searching for whatever the judge was referencing, and I watched, with the same patient stillness I'd been holding since I signed, the exact moment his confidence began to waver. Evelyn herself leaned forward slightly, her practiced smile still in place, but something behind her eyes sharpening now. The particular recalibration of someone realizing a negotiation has just shifted onto ground she didn't know existed. "Ms. Bennet," Judge Collins said, turning to me directly, "are you aware of this trust instrument?" "I am, Your Honor," I said, and I felt Michael's hand rest briefly, reassuringly, on the edge of the table between us. "My late husband created it several years ago. I understand it was designed to activate automatically under certain conditions related to any challenge to the family home's ownership. If you've ever watched a courtroom's entire balance of power shift in the space of a single question, comment, 'The room went still,' below. This is where everything I'd been carrying finally comes into the light." Evelyn's attorney requested a brief conference with his client before the judge proceeded further, and I watched, from across the courtroom, the specific unraveling body language of a man who had walked into that hearing certain of his position and was now visibly recalculating everything in real time. Evelyn's own composure held for a few moments longer than his did, the same practiced elegance she brought to every public appearance, but I noticed, watching her closely, the way her hand had gone very still on the table in front of her, the particular stillness of someone working very hard not to let a room see exactly how much ground had just shifted underneath them. "This is clearly some kind of error," I heard her murmur to her attorney, not quite quietly enough. "Daniel never mentioned anything like this to me." I understood, hearing that, exactly how much of Evelyn's confidence in this entire proceeding had rested on an assumption I now recognized as central to Daniel's entire design, that his mother had believed, with total certainty, that she understood every relevant detail of her son's estate planning, because she had always positioned herself throughout his life as the person who understood him best. Daniel, apparently, had understood something about his mother that even she hadn't accounted for, that the version of him she believed she knew completely had, in fact, built an entire protective structure around a fear he'd never once discussed with her directly. If you've ever watched someone's absolute certainty crack in real time, the moment they realized they'd never actually known as much as they assumed, comment, "That unraveling was earned," below. I want to explain what I actually knew, walking into that hearing, because I don't think the moment carries its full weight without understanding exactly how much I'd chosen not to know in advance. Michael Lawson had told me, 3 months earlier, in the careful, measured tone he used for everything, that Daniel had created additional protections around the family home years before his death. Protections Michael was not yet able to discuss in full detail because they remained under seal pending certain conditions. "I need you to trust me on the timing here," he'd told me in his office, the week I'd first considered simply conceding the house to avoid prolonging the exhausting court battle Evelyn had initiated. Daniel was very specific about how and when this needed to unfold. "I know that's difficult to hear when you're this tired. I promise you it matters." I had trusted him, not because I fully understood what he meant, but because 9 years of practicing law had taught me to recognize the particular gravity of an attorney who knows something significant and is choosing his timing deliberately, rather than carelessly. I signed the settlement that morning, not out of surrender, but because Michael had told me, plainly, the week before the hearing, that signing was actually the trigger the trust required, that Daniel had built the protection specifically around the moment someone else attempted to claim the house through exactly this kind of pressured settlement, and that resisting the settlement directly would have left the trust dormant, unable to do the work Daniel had designed it to do. If you've ever had to trust a plan you didn't fully understand, because someone you trusted told you the timing mattered more than your own instinct to fight directly, comment, "That takes real trust," below. Judge Collins called a recess to review the sealed trust instrument in full, And it was during that recess, sitting in a small conference room with Michael, while Evelyn and her attorney conferred anxiously in the hallway, that he finally walked me through the complete picture Daniel had built. "Your husband came to me almost 4 years before he passed," Michael said, spreading a copy of the original trust documents across the table. He'd had a difficult conversation with his mother, something about a property dispute involving one of her own business partners, and it apparently unsettled him enough that he started asking very specific questions about what would happen to your home if anyone ever tried to challenge your ownership after his death. He didn't seem to expect it would be his own mother, but he wanted the protection broad enough to cover any challenge from anyone, under any pretext. "Why didn't he just tell me?" I asked, and I heard, even as I said it, the particular ache underneath the question. Not suspicion, just grief, wishing I'd had the chance to understand this alongside him rather than discovering it in pieces, after his death, in a courtroom. "He asked me that question myself, actually," Michael said gently. "He told me he didn't want you carrying the weight of anticipating his own mother's potential betrayal while he was still alive to prevent it directly. He said, and I remember this because it struck me at the time, that he'd rather quietly build you a floor that could never give out beneath you than spend years making you worry about a fall that might never come. He wanted you protected, not burdened." If you've ever discovered that someone you loved had quietly protected you from a fear they never wanted you to have to carry, comment, "That's real love," below. We're just getting started. Michael told me more that afternoon about the business dispute that had originally prompted Daniel's concern. A property acquisition Evelyn had pursued years earlier, involving an elderly business partner whose family had later challenged, unsuccessfully, whether he'd been of sound mind when he signed away his controlling interest in a joint development. Daniel, apparently, had quietly followed that litigation closely, troubled enough by what he'd learned about his mother's tactics that he'd never fully shared the details with me, not wanting to burden our marriage with suspicion about a woman who was, after all, his own mother. He told me once that watching that case unfold was the first time he understood, really understood, that his mother was capable of framing almost any acquisition as generosity, regardless of how much pressure or confusion sat underneath it, Michael said. He didn't want to believe she'd ever turn that same instinct on you and Noah. But he built the protection anyway, because he told me he'd rather be wrong and have built something unnecessary than be right and have left you unprotected. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, with a grief that had nothing to do with the courtroom battle itself, exactly how much quiet, careful worry Daniel had carried on my behalf without ever once letting it become my burden too. I thought about every ordinary evening in our kitchen, every unremarkable Tuesday, wondering how many of them had actually been shadowed by a concern he'd deliberately chosen not to share. If you've ever learned, after losing someone, just how much quiet worry they'd carried on your behalf without ever once letting you feel its weight, comment, "I wish I'd known, and I'm glad I didn't have to," below. The trust itself, once Michael walked me through its full mechanics, was more sophisticated than I initially understood. Daniel hadn't simply willed the house to me outright, a protection that could theoretically have been challenged through exactly the kind of undue influence claims Evelyn's attorney had already begun quietly preparing. Instead, he'd established an irrevocable family trust, structured with a delayed activation clause that remained entirely dormant unless a specific triggering event occurred. Any formal legal challenge to the property's ownership within the probate process, filed by anyone other than myself or Noah directly. The moment Evelyn's attorney filed the original probate challenge, the trust was already, technically, active. Michael explained, it simply required the court's formal review to fully execute, which is precisely what today's hearing provided. Daniel built it this way, deliberately. He wanted it to remain completely invisible unless someone actually tried what he feared. If no one had ever challenged your ownership, the trust would have simply sat there, permanently, and you'd never have needed to know the specifics at all. I sat with that, turning it over the way I'd turn over any elegantly constructed legal instrument, except this one had been built entirely around protecting me, by a husband who had understood, with a clarity I hadn't fully credited him with while he was alive, exactly what his mother might eventually attempt. Michael slid one more document across the table, the last piece of what Daniel had prepared. A handwritten letter, sealed separately, addressed to me, that Michael said he'd been instructed to deliver, only if the trust's activation clause was ever actually triggered. "I think you should read this somewhere quieter than a courthouse conference room," Michael said gently, "but I wanted you to have it before we go back in. If you've ever received something someone you loved had prepared specifically for a moment they hoped you'd never need, comment, 'I need a minute for that one,' below." Chapter 3 is where I finally read what Daniel left me, and where Evelyn's attorney realizes exactly how much this case has already changed. I read Daniel's letter alone, in the small courthouse conference room, Michael stepping out to give me privacy. I hadn't realized I needed until the door closed behind him. His handwriting was familiar and unsteady in a way that told me he'd written it in one sitting. Not a polished, careful document, but something closer to a man saying everything he needed to say before he ran out of time to say it properly. Olivia, if you're reading this, it means my mother did exactly what some part of me always feared she might. I'm sorry I never told you directly. I told myself it was to protect you from worrying, and that's partly true, but I think, if I'm honest, it was also because I didn't want to admit, even to myself, what my own mother might be capable of. I built this protection so you'd never have to fight her alone, even after I couldn't be there to stand beside you. Noah is going to need you steady, not vengeful. Protect him. Protect the home we built. And please, don't let this turn you bitter. That was never the point of any of it. I sat with that letter for a long time, grief and gratitude tangled together in a way I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to fully separate, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly how much love and foresight had gone into a document I'd only just now been allowed to read. If you've ever received a letter from someone you lost that told you exactly who they needed you to be, even after they were gone, comment, "I hear you, Daniel," below. This is the breaking point. I called my own mother that night, needing, more than I'd expected to, the specific comfort of a voice that had known me long before any of this. Before Daniel, before Evelyn, before any of the careful, professional composure I'd learned to hold in courtrooms. I read her portions of the letter, my voice breaking in places it hadn't broken in the courtroom itself, and she listened, quiet and steady, the way she always had. "He loved you exactly the way you deserved to be loved," she told me. Quietly, thoroughly, thinking 3 steps ahead so you'd never have to carry the weight yourself. That's rare, Olivia. Don't let grief make you forget how rare that actually was. I don't know how to feel, I admitted, grateful and furious and exhausted, and none of those feelings seemed to leave room for the others. "They don't have to," she said. "You're allowed to hold all of it at once. That's not confusion. That's just what loving someone complicated enough to be worth all of it actually feels like." I hung up that night, steadier than I'd been in months. Not because anything about the legal battle had resolved, but because I'd finally let myself feel the full weight of what Daniel had done, instead of processing it only through the careful, professional lens I'd been using to survive the courtroom itself. If you've ever needed a parent's steady voice to help you hold grief and gratitude in the same breath, comment, "That call mattered," below. Evelyn's attorney requested a continuance to review the trust's validity, a request Judge Collins granted, though not before making a specific, pointed observation from the bench that I understood, even in the moment, was going to shape everything that followed. "I want to note for the record," she said, "that this court takes very seriously any suggestion that a settlement was procured through pressure applied to a grieving spouse. I'll expect full transparency from all parties moving forward, particularly regarding the timeline of when this trust instrument was created and why it remained under seal. Evelyn's composure, by the time the hearing adjourned for the day, had fractured considerably from the polished warmth she'd walked in with. I watched her exit the courtroom without a single word to the reporters who'd gathered specifically to photograph her victory, her attorney trailing behind her with the particular hurried step of a man recalculating an entire case strategy in real time. Evelyn called me herself. 2 days later, her voice carrying none of the courtroom performance, something rawer and more defensive underneath it. "You planned this," she said. "You and Daniel, behind my back, for years. Do you understand how that looks, Olivia? Like you were always waiting for a chance to humiliate me." "Daniel built a protection for his family," I said, keeping my voice level, though something in me ached unexpectedly at how thoroughly she'd already decided to recast herself as the wronged party. "The only person who determined how this would look was you. The moment you decided to challenge a grieving widow's ownership of her own home in open court, with reporters present, 4 months after your son's death." She didn't have an answer for that, and the call ended in a silence that told me, more clearly than the courtroom had, exactly how unprepared she was to examine her own choices honestly. If you've ever had someone recast their own scheme as your betrayal, the moment it stopped working in their favor, comment that reversal is familiar below. It was 3 weeks later, during the discovery process Michael initiated to establish the trust's full validity, that the investigation uncovered something none of us had anticipated, financial records showing that Evelyn had, over the preceding 2 years, quietly redirected funds from a joint investment account she'd shared with Daniel's late father's estate, funds that should have been distributed, in part, to Daniel and, by extension, to Noah, but had instead been absorbed into Evelyn's own luxury development ventures without proper disclosure. Michael walked me through the specifics carefully, spreading bank statements and transfer records across his conference table, the same way he'd once spread Daniel's original trust documents. "This isn't a single questionable transaction," he said. "This is a pattern, going back at least 2 years before your husband's death, of funds being moved out of an account he had partial claim to, structured carefully enough that it likely would have gone unnoticed indefinitely if this litigation hadn't forced a full accounting." I thought about a conversation with Daniel, years earlier, mentioning almost in passing that his mother had some complicated finances tied up in his father's old accounts, a detail he'd never elaborated on and I'd never pressed, assuming it was simply the ordinary complexity of a family with significant wealth. I understood now, reading through the records Michael had compiled, that Daniel had likely sensed something troubling in that complexity without ever having the full picture himself. One more thread in the same pattern that had eventually led him to build the protective trust in the first place. If you've ever looked back at an offhand comment and realized it had actually been the first thread of something much larger, comment, "Hindsight changes everything" below. I stopped hoping, somewhere in the middle of that discovery process, for any version of this, where Evelyn simply, finally, admitted what she'd done without needing to be forced into it by financial records neither of us had gone looking for. I had spent 4 months absorbing her performed grief, her practiced warmth for reporters, her quiet, persistent pressure, dressed up as concern for the family's peace. And I understood, reading through the financial disclosures Michael's investigators had compiled, exactly how long this pattern had actually been running. Not just a single attempt to claim the house after Daniel's death, but years of a mother-in-law who had always treated family wealth as something to be quietly redirected in whatever direction served her own interests, regardless of who it technically belonged to. I thought about every family dinner where Evelyn had subtly suggested I wasn't managing our finances the way Daniel's father would have wanted. every comment about my modest background delivered with a smile designed to sound like concern, rather than condescension. I understood finally that I had never actually been treated as family in any way that mattered to her, only as an obstacle standing between Evelyn and control over resources she had always considered rightfully hers to manage. Michael called me the evening the full financial picture came together, his voice carrying a gravity I hadn't heard from him even during the initial trust discovery. "This isn't just about the house anymore, Olivia," he said. "What we're looking at now is a pattern of financial misconduct spanning years, potentially affecting more than just your family's estate. I think Judge Collins needs to see all of it, together, at the next hearing." I asked him, that night, whether he thought other people might have been affected by the same pattern. Other business partners, other family members Evelyn had positioned herself to control the same way she'd tried to control me. "I think it's likely," he said carefully. "I've had 2 other attorneys reach out quietly since word of this case started circulating in local legal circles, asking whether we'd found anything relevant to disputes they're handling involving Evelyn Harper's business dealings. I think this case is about to become considerably larger than your family's estate, whether either of us intended that or not." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, understanding that whatever came next in that courtroom was no longer only about protecting Noah's inheritance. It had become, without my ever choosing it directly, a reckoning for a pattern of behavior that had likely cost other families far more than they'd ever been able to prove on their own. If you've ever discovered that the thing protecting your own family accidentally became protection for strangers too, comment, "That's how justice should work," below. Chapter 4 is where all of it finally comes together in that courtroom. Evelyn's attorney attempted, at the final hearing, a strategy I recognized immediately from Michael's earlier warning about how families like this typically respond once cornered. Not an admission, but an attack. "Your Honor," he said, "we believe the timeline here raises serious questions about undue influence. Mr. Bennett was in declining health in the months before his passing, and we have reason to believe Ms. Bennett may have pressured him into creating this trust while he wasn't of entirely sound judgment." I felt my jaw tighten, the specific, controlled anger of hearing my grief and my husband's careful, loving foresight recast as manipulation in front of a room of strangers. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into the folder I'd carried into every hearing and slid a stack of documents across the table to Michael, who passed them forward to the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Daniel Bennett's complete medical records from the 18 months preceding the trust's creation, confirming full cognitive competence throughout," Michael said. "I'd also like to submit the notarized, witnessed signing documentation from the original trust creation, along with sworn statements from 2 independent witnesses present at the signing who can confirm Mr. Bennett's clarity and intent. And finally, Your Honor, I'd like to submit Mr. Bennett's own handwritten letter, prepared specifically to be read in the event this exact accusation was ever raised." If you've ever watched someone try to weaponize your grief, and grief for grief's sake, and grief prepare its own quiet, patient defense in advance, comment, "He thought of everything," below. This is the reveal. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Collins read through Daniel's letter in full, the same words that had broken something open in me weeks earlier now doing their work in front of the entire room. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully and addressed Evelyn's attorney directly. "Counsel, I want to be exceptionally clear," she said. "This court has now reviewed extensive, unambiguous evidence of the decedent's full competence and clear intent at the time this trust was created, along with a written record of the decedent's own anticipation of precisely the accusation you've just raised. I find no basis whatsoever for an undue influence claim. The trust stands as fully enforceable." She continued, turning her attention now to the financial discovery Michael had submitted separately. "Furthermore, given the pattern of fund diversion uncovered during this proceeding's discovery process, I am ordering a freeze on all disputed assets connected to Ms. Harper's business accounts, pending a full forensic audit, and I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for further investigation into potential elder financial exploitation and fraud. Given the additional inquiries this court has received from other affected parties during the course of this case. Evelyn's face, across the courtroom, had gone entirely pale. The polished composure she'd walked in with 4 months earlier, completely, permanently gone. Her attorney sat frozen for a long moment before finally, quietly, requesting a recess he clearly needed more for himself than for his client. If you've ever watched a judge's ruling systematically dismantle every piece of a case someone had been so certain would work, comment the silence in that room below. Evelyn approached me in the courthouse hallway during that recess, her composure gone entirely now, something raw and unguarded in her expression that I had genuinely never seen from her in 8 years of knowing her. "You've destroyed me," she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Everything I built, everything I spent my whole life on." "I didn't destroy anything," I said, keeping my voice level, though something in me ached at the sight of her, unexpectedly, even after everything. "You built a life on taking from people who trusted you and hiding it well enough that no one ever had to look closely. I just happened to be the daughter-in-law who knew how to look." "Daniel would be horrified at what you've turned this into," she said, one last reach for the leverage that had worked on so many people for so many years. "Daniel wrote a letter specifically anticipating you'd say exactly that," I said quietly. "He knew you well enough to know you'd never actually take accountability, even when the evidence left no room for anything else. I think the person who'd actually be horrified, if he were here, is the man who spent years quietly protecting his family from a mother he loved and also, apparently, never fully trusted." She didn't have anything left to say to that. I watched her walk away down that courthouse hallway, and I understood, watching her go, that whatever came next for her, the forensic audit, the additional civil suits, the reputation that would never recover, none of it had actually been my doing. It had simply been the truth, finally allowed room to exist without her careful management of it. If you've ever had someone try one final time to make you responsible for consequences they built entirely themselves, comment, "That's not how accountability works." Below. The forensic audit, once completed over the following months, confirmed what Michael's initial investigation had only begun to uncover: a pattern of financial misconduct spanning nearly a decade, affecting not just Daniel's estate, but at least 3 other family relationships Evelyn had leveraged over the years, using the same combination of practiced public generosity and private financial control. 2 additional civil suits were filed once the pattern became public record. Families who had quietly suspected mismanagement for years, but had never had the resources or the standing to prove it on their own. One of those families, the Whitmores, reached out to me directly once their own case became public. A widow named Grace Whitmore, whose late husband had been the business partner Daniel originally worried about years before his own death. The case, I realized with a chill, that had first prompted Daniel to build his protective trust in the first place. "Your husband's foresight ended up protecting people he never even met," Grace told me, over coffee. The first of several conversations that would eventually become something like friendship. "I wish I'd had someone in my corner the way you did. I'm just grateful someone finally did." Evelyn's public reputation, built over 3 decades of galas and luxury developments and carefully cultivated business relationships, did not survive the coverage that followed. The same reporters she'd invited to photograph her expected victory outside that first probate hearing were the ones who eventually reported, in considerably less flattering detail, the full scope of what the investigation had found. I want to be honest that I took no satisfaction in watching that unfold, the same honesty I've tried to bring to every part of this account. I had not built this case to destroy Evelyn Harper's reputation. I had simply refused to let her destroy my son's future, and the truth, once it was allowed to surface fully, had simply run its own course from there. If you've ever watched The Truth, simply do the work you never actually set out to do yourself. Comment, "That's not revenge, that's just consequence," below. Noah asked me, months later, once the legal proceedings had finally settled, why Grandma Evelyn didn't visit anymore. I told him the truth, in language gentle enough for an 8-year-old to hold, without being crushed by it. That Grandma Evelyn had made some choices that hurt our family, that Daddy had loved us enough to make sure we'd always be protected, and that sometimes protecting people you love means making hard decisions other people don't understand or agree with. "Daddy really thought of everything, huh?" Noah said, with the specific, matter-of-fact wisdom children sometimes offer without fully realizing its weight. "He really did," I told him, and I meant it more than any sentence I'd said in that courtroom. I kept the family home, exactly as Daniel had intended, and I used part of the settlement from the resolved civil claims to do something I don't think even Daniel had specifically anticipated, though I believe, with everything I understand about the man I married, that he would have approved completely. I converted the home's detached carriage house into a small legal resource center, staffed part-time by myself and 2 colleagues, offering free consultations to widowed parents and single mothers, navigating exactly the kind of predatory probate challenges I'd once faced myself, women who didn't have a late husband's carefully constructed trust waiting to protect them, and who needed, instead, someone willing to sit across the table and explain, patiently, exactly what their rights actually were. Grace Whitmore was one of the first volunteers, once the center opened, and watching her sit across from a frightened young widow during our first month of operation, offering the same steady reassurance she'd once needed herself, felt like the clearest evidence I had that something good could actually be built out of everything this ordeal had cost both of us. I didn't get revenge, in the end, not in the way the version of me sitting at that first hearing, watching Evelyn's satisfied smile, might have once imagined wanting it. I got something quieter, and I've come to understand it as considerably more valuable. I got the truth, confirmed on paper in a form no one could ever again talk me out of. I got my son's future, secured exactly the way his father intended. And I got the chance to turn what could have been my family's private tragedy into something that now quietly protects other families who never had a Daniel of their own to build them a floor that couldn't give out beneath them. The greatest victory was never going to be watching Evelyn Harper lose everything. It was understanding finally that Daniel had loved me exactly as thoroughly as I'd always hoped he had, quietly, patiently, thinking 3 steps ahead, right up until the very end. The end.